When it comes to id, what's the first thing you think of? Probably either Doom, Quake, or Wolfenstein, right? Well, a newer game that's been released soon after the merger with Bethesda was Rage, a first-person shooter based in a post-apocalyptic world, not unlike games like Fallout and Borderlands. There's a few similarities, but for the most part, Rage does a good job in differentiating itself from other end-of-world style games. First, the world didn't become a mess from a nuclear bomb. Instead, in this game, it was a massive string of gigantic asteroids that came crashing down Earth. In a last-minute preparation, many soldiers were placed in cryogenic tubes to be awakened a few years after the catastrophic events. These self-sustaining pods were called ARCs. Unfortunately, most ARC participants didn't make it, as usually their life support machinery fouled up and caused death. Luckily for you, you survived, and now it's up to you to save the world from bandits and a tyrannical government set on controlling everything. If it sounds cliché, sadly, it is. The story isn't one of the strongest points of the game, and although you'll keep playing to see if anything gets any more interesting, it really doesn't. In fact, I consider this game to have one of the most anticlimactic endings I've ever seen. Near the end of the game, you start hearing about the leading soldier from the government's forces, named the Authority, so you start planning an invasion on their capital. You infiltrate their base, get to make a computer core to release all the other ARC survivors, and wait for the final battle, only for it to never happen. It's just a huge mindfuck, as it's a giant build-up and then nothing. It's like walking up 1,000 stairs to a giant mound of infinite wealth, only for the stairs to turn into a giant slide at the 999th step. You could feel the presence of something, and then it's just taken away from you just like that. What does suck about this is that there are other bosses in the game. Although there aren't very many, they do exist, although the majority of them are painfully easy with the right weaponry. Their attacks are usually telegraphed easily, and it's just more of a minor roadblock than an actual difficult boss. So what is Rage like? As I said, it's similar to games like Fallout 3, but it's a bit less open world and a bit more linear. That's not to say there's a complete linearity to it though. Many of the actual stages are a straight point A to a point B job, but when you're driving around in the wasteland, there's multiple paths to each destination. Basically, the wasteland is your map. You can walk if you really want, although it's not recommended, or most commonly, you'll drive to each destination using one of 3 vehicles. Each destination you can drive to takes the role of your stages. Most stages will be completed at least twice, but in between stages you'll be blowing up bandit and authority vehicles. There's a few other things to do in your vehicles too, such as jumping through floating robots. There's also races you can participate in that take place in closed circuits in the wasteland, but those are started in each of the 2 major towns, Wellspring and Subway Town. The big thing about the wasteland is just how believable it looks. There's sand and jagged cliffs all over the place. One area shows a massive crater where an asteroid had hit. There's a swamp with unusual flowers growing out of it. It just looks the part, which is always awesome with games like this. The graphical style does a really good job at conveying this too. The only problem with the visuals, at least I've noticed on the PS3 version, is that sometimes the textures won't load fast enough. So when you're walking, you see dull walls until the textures load in. This isn't so bad, as usually if you give it a second, it'll load in properly, but at least it doesn't interrupt the action with constant loading screens. In fact, the only loading you'll ever see is the loading in between each area. The biggest pain though is if you die. There are checkpoints, but the game constitutes checkpoints as entering or exiting a stage. So if you get to the end of a level and die, and you choose to resume from last checkpoint, you'll be back at the beginning of that area. So instead, you can go save your game every few minutes to prevent this. I'm sure the PC version probably has a quick save option, which unfortunately is lacking in the PS3 game. I spoke about dying, so let's move on to that subject for a bit. Rage features the regenerating health system, much like almost every other frickin' shooter out there. When you die, you get a chance to revive yourself. Apparently the nanomachines in your body include a defibrillator, allowing you to jumpstart your heart upon hitting dying conditions. Anyway, in order to do so, you must move each analog stick to the highlighted position and then press either L2 or R2, or both. Do this a few times and you'll charge up the defibrillator. Now, part 2 just requires you to try and get the moving cursors to the highlighted spots. Upon doing so, you'll revive, usually with full health, and conveniently pass an electric shock to any nearby foes, rendering them helpless for a few seconds. You can't keep doing this though, as the defibrillator needs time to charge, which is usually a few minutes. You can later get an extra defib upgrade, and also one later on to reduce the time required to recharge the defib. The reduced time one can be tricky to get, as it requires you to save about 20 Feltrite crystals. And if you didn't know this existed, like me the first time I played it, you might sell off all the Feltrite and not have enough to purchase the upgrade. They do give you 50 bucks a piece, so it's a good way to get money. One more thing about the game before I move on to the combat. The controls are incredibly smooth. None of the tasks really feel like a chore, because because everything is incredibly responsive. The only quirk is that in order to search corpses for ammo, you need to look at them and press X. It's not as bad as a game like Infernal, which required you to hold a button down for a good 5 seconds to loot enemies, but it can still be a bit annoying when there's multiple guys lying dead on top of each other. So, let's go on to the meat of the game, the combat. Honestly, it's just plain fun. There's not a huge selection of weapons like Fallout 3 or especially Borderlands, but there's enough to keep you occupied. And what's cool is that almost every weapon has 2 to 4 different ammo types. For example, the shotgun has its regular buckshot, but also EMP pulses and pop rockets, which essentially turn your shotgun into a grenade launcher. This extra ammo is typically a bit more difficult to find in the wild, but you're able to craft them with recipes gained from the many NPCs loitering around. Many times you're required to buy them from the shop, but some quests will reward you with the crafting recipes. The game features iron sights as well, but they're not required to use. The accuracy of the guns is fairly decent without them, and many times you'll probably be within close range of the enemy. Naturally, you'll need the sights with weapons such as the sniper rifle, and it's highly recommended for the kick-ass crossbow you get. The combat is especially fun, though, because the AI actually feels realistic. The dumber bandits will start shouting commands and eventually try to retreat, but will also try to blindly fire at you from cover and attempt to flank you. The biggest fault is that every freaking enemy can take more than one shot to the head unless it's with a sniper rifle. Many times a headshot will knock an enemy on their ass, but they lay there dazed and eventually try to fire at you anyway. Typically you can hit them before they can come to their senses, but for the guys not wearing any sort of helmet, it feels kinda cheap. Again, most of the combat takes place in the quote-unquote dungeons of the game, and each of these are point-to-point ventures. The problem though is that each point is essentially the same place, so you walk a literal loop to the exit. The typical layout is that you enter a stage, blast whatever moves, get to the mission objective, and then a door opens up allowing you to backtrack to the starting point, which becomes the exit. Only a small handful of areas have distinct entrances and exits. What's worse is that often you'll have extra missions that will require you to revisit an area you've already cleared because another group of bandits decided to take refuge there. I get it that it's to prolong the playing life of the game, but you can't help but to think that there's something else id could have done to put more time into the game. In fact, even if you do the secondary jobs, the game is fairly short. With the side jobs, I'd say you got about 20 hours invested into the game. Without them, you can easily complete it in about 10 hours, and that's being really generous. It's not that you'd want to rush through the game though, because there is a lot to do. For one, there's a bunch of mini-games that you can enjoy. There's a basic Simon-like game that requires you to memorize banjo notes and to repeat them. There's a 5-finger fillet game, where you try to stab the spaces in between your spread out fingers, and hope you don't stab yourself in the process. There's a total game of luck in which you roll 4 dice, each of which has either a crosshair or a skull. Roll 4 targets to win. You have 3 chances, but the sooner you win, the better payout you get. You also get access to a card game that bears resemblance to Magic the Gathering game. Also, don't forget about the races, as you can earn racing certificates that are used to upgrade your vehicles. Finally though, we come to my favorite game, Mutant Bash TV. Your first encounter with this game when trying to win a sponsorship to race in a high-risk circuit that rewards a better buggy. The owner, J.K. Styles, is some fat dude who seems not to want to wear pants. Think of this game as an updated 3D version of the old arcade game Smash TV. You go through 5 rooms killing mutants as fast as you can. I'd recommend bringing in a shotgun and as much ammo as possible, as it makes it pretty effortless. The faster you kill these things, the more money you get. There's even a bonus round that rewards moderately well if you're good with a slot machine. You can repeat this game as many times as you want, although the final boss of it only appears during your first attempt. If you ever run low on cash, this is the best way to rack it up, and it's just plain fun. J.K. Styles isn't the only oddball character in the game. The game definitely has a sense of humor, which is typically in the form of the characters and some of the older ID and Bethesda references. You'll meet up with Crazy Joe near the swamp, which is actually named after him. Upon closer inspection, yeah, Crazy Joe is indeed that crazy. But he's also sporting a white t-shirt with the classic Doom logo on it. When you first enter the buggy in the beginning, there's a Doom Soldier bobblehead doll. There's also a Blake Stone bobblehead too, again referencing an older id game. Hell, the alternative fire on the Authority minigun is considered a BFG, and it does just as much damage as you would expect. Although just like Doom 3, if you hold it down too long, it'll blow up and kill you. Finally, in one of the funniest references, there's a Twinkie ripoff called Pinkies. When you pick it up, you hear the monsters growl. It doesn't stop with the references in-game though. Even the trophies are named after many of the older games. For example, the trophies requiring you to beat the game are labeled after the Doom difficulties. If you can get around the semi-linear feel of the game, Rage is a great game. It may feel a bit short, but there's still a lot to do to keep yourself occupied. In fact, if it decides to make Doom 4 from this engine or playstyle, I'll pre-order it right now. Just for your own sake, don't pay too much mind to the story. Otherwise you'll be extremely disappointed with the ending. Final score? 8 out of 10. This is Reaper. Happy fragging.